Welcome everyone. Thanks for coming. I hope to make this meeting worthwhile. I know some of you came from quite a distance, and I'm grateful for that. It's good to see so many familiar faces. I know there's several other people indicated they were going to be here, so maybe they'll come in as we get started. This will probably be the last lecture for a while. Because I'm going to have to go back out to California to try to get my ranch sold out there. And it's a bit of a chore to get that done. So I've got to go out there and look to a few things. So it's liable to be a month, 2 months, maybe more before I can do another lecture, back here to do another lecture. But we'll sure let you know, won't we, Stephen, when that happens. Stephen Retz is in charge of all this. He's the man that makes all this happen, so I have to give him a nod for his extra effort. All right, well, today we get to talk about the backstory, and I tend to get off on tangents, so if I'm too far off in a tangent, just wave your hands or something and I'll try to get back on point. I never intended to write books. I never intended to lecture. I never expected to discover the information that I've discovered. Had no notion it was even out there. I assumed that most everything there was to know about the gospel was there for anyone to know. If you went to church and attended your gospel doctrine classes and did a little bit of scripture study, you pretty much got it all. But I had an abiding desire to understand prophecy because it seemed like a bit of a conundrum to me. It didn't make much sense. An example of that, I think I've written a monograph about this. It's on my blog, but I was living when I was about a primary age, I don't know which year. I was living in, attending the First Ward in Salt Lake. The First Ward, not the 10th, not the 132nd, the First Ward. And the irony in that I didn't realize the irony in that until much later, but the school I attended, the grade school I attended, was just next door. So on Tuesdays or Wednesdays, I think it was Tuesdays they had primary. It's been too many years, so I'm not real sure. We didn't have the block program like we did today, you know. But we'd get out of school, and the first primary kid that got from Hamilton School over to the chapel next door got to ring this big brass bell to remind all the other kids to come to primary instead of going home as they normally would after school. I always wanted to get over there to ring that bell, but I could never manage to get out of school in time. Anyway, I can remember at a primary age, I went to primary one afternoon, and the subject was prophets. And so, you know, it was the first time the concept of a prophet really made any impact on me. And the thing that really stuck with me is she said, well, these prophets saw the future in vision. And as a result, they wrote down what they saw. And we can read in the scriptures, in the Bible, the Book of Mormon, the Pearl of Great Price, we can read what they had to say about the future. I thought, wow, that's great. I went home and thumbed through the scriptures and found the book of Revelation, because she'd mentioned that one. And primary age, I was trying to read the book of Revelation and make sense of it. That's kind of a thumbnail sketch of how I got started. Shows I guess, kind of an innate interest in prophecy. I don't know where it came from. It was just there. I do have, I've been diagnosed with a bit of Asperger's, which means that I can easily fixate on things that most other people think is of little or no consequence. It's a form of autism. Means when I was younger, I felt like the fifth wheel in any social situation. So I took a lot of comfort in simply studying, reading a lot. I can remember when I published my first book, one of my uncles, Dave Halgren, great man, candy maker, he said to me when I showed him my first book, he read it and he came back to me and said, "Where did you learn all this?" I don't know, I just read. I liked reading. Read a lot. So anyway, and it's strange how it all came together. That same chapel, I don't know how old I was, maybe 14, 13. I looked it up on the internet the other day, and I could only find one picture of that old chapel. It's been demolished now.
Whereabouts was it?
It was at 7th, on 7th East between 7th and 8th South, right next to Hamilton School. None of those things are there. It was right next to the Park Stake Center, which is still there. One of the first stake centers the church ever built, maybe the first, I don't know. David O. McKay came to dedicate it. I remember the occasion. I was there. It was very impressive. First time I went to General Conference on more than one occasion, but the only time I ever saw a prophet up close and personal, you know. So anyway, I had what, since this is a backstory, you're going to have to indulge me. It's just my story, I guess. At the age of 13 or 14, I had what I think was probably a near-death experience. I didn't learn any of the things that near-death NDEs, I believe they call them, that they come back and experience. What was happening is I was climbing around the chapel with my buddies and I, around the outside. There's a ledge that went around the building, and there was a big ledge across the front with some big vertical windows, and the stairways went up on both sides to the entry of the chapel. The chapel is actually on the second story, and the rec room and the cultural hall were downstairs in kind of a half basement. So it was a very tall building. And this ledge on the front happened to be only a few feet from the abutment to the stairway. So we could jump from the ledge to the abutment, you know. One of us discovered, it wasn't me, but I engaged in the competition. We were putting a mark or something, I've forgotten how far we could jump from this ledge to the abutment. And I've since learned that the drop from where I was roughly 16 feet to solid pavement, cement. And we made some jumps, several jumps, and I was successful the first time or two, but the third time it didn't work. And all I can remember is seeing brick going by, you know. That's the last conscious memory that I have. The next thing that I felt, by the way, my buddies climbed down off the ledge, ran down the stairs, tried to get some response from me, couldn't, ran 2 blocks to my parents' house, knocked on the door. When I don't think it was my mother came to the door, they said, "You better come quick, Tony's dead."
Oh, I forgot of mother. Wow.
So, in the meantime, I guess Dad jumped in his old green Olds 88 and came screaming down, because the next thing I remember after the bricks going by was it felt like my body was hollow and full of angry bees, just this loud roaring, buzzing. And as that feeling began to subside, I realized I was lying on my face, and I pushed up, and there's this large pool of blood because I split my head open. I still have a scar here. I split my head open, and I was bleeding, and you know, head wounds bleed profusely. I raised up, and I heard screeching brakes, and I looked up and saw my dad's green Olds sliding into the parking space in front of the chapel. And my parents jumped out, and of course they could see I was all right because I was pushing up. It wasn't until years later when I read the book by Raymond J. Moody, Life After Life, where he cataloged the many commonalities in near-death experiences. And he noted that one of them was way down the list, but he said people who come back report feeling like they're in a swarm of angry bees or roaring bells, like a chorus of giant cathedral bells ringing. They report this sound. And so that's why I say I think I had a near-death experience. I'm not at all sure that it really happened, but the bottom line is I didn't even have a concussion. They had to put 7 stitches. I fell 17 feet to a cement slab. I should have been, at the very least, crippled or incapacitated in some way. And all they did is put 7 stitches in my forehead and send me home. And that's one of those things that I've asked myself over the years, why it was that I survived that, and there are probably other near misses that I've forgotten about, but anyway. That's as I look back now on my life, that's a kind of bit of wonderment, you know, how did that manage to happen? Anyway, I can remember a gentleman approaching me about that same time with this convoluted illustration of prophecy, quotes from Revelation and Daniel and other places in the Bible and the Book of Mormon, that it was his explanation of prophecy. And I just remember thinking, how can it be so confusing? Why would the Lord want to use prophecy, this symbolic language, all of these images that just horses and dragons and kings and beasts and wheels and, I mean, you name it. And that's pretty much where I left prophecy until I was serving my mission. And at that time, I served in Mexico, central Mexico. Now there are only 3 missions in the whole country when I was down there. And they just divided the one that I went to. I remember Dwayne Crowther's book, Keys to Prophecy, I believe is the title.
Prophecy, Key to the Future.
Prophecy, Key to the Future, thank you. His book came out, and I read it cover to cover, and I'd previously read everything Cleon Skousen had written, but I found it all fascinating, but it was all subject to interpretation. And it would cite a scripture here and a scripture there, and then try to say, well, put it in some kind of chronological event. First, this is going to happen, and then that's going to happen, and it all seemed very contrived to me. More so now than then, probably, but it did. So I was raising my family, and I found myself in Casper, Wyoming for a year. I won't belabor you with the details. But at that time, as in every ward I'd ever been in, they called me to be the gospel doctrine instructor. And because of my proclivity for reading, I knew a lot, and I certainly knew my scriptures. I can't quote you chapter and verse, but I can tell you what the scriptures say. I can't even quote it verbatim, word for word, but I can tell you what it is that the scriptures are talking about. Always have been able to. Anyway, they seem to be talking about. And I moved into a subdivision called Paradise Valley, and it was anything but. If you've ever been to Casper, Wyoming, there's not much to recommend it. I lived on a street called Indian Paintbrush, and it was right next, the whole subdivision was built around this big hill. And there were 2 or 3 of them. And when I say a big hill, it wasn't a mountain, but it was a substantial hill. It'd take you about 15 minutes to climb to the top of it. There was nothing up there, no radio towers, no tanks, nothing. It was just the top of a hill. And when you got to the top of the hill, you could see the subdivision all the way around you and the highway behind, and you could see for quite a distance. But you were alone, even though you were still in the middle of suburbia, you were alone. And the reason I tell you all this is because as I taught my gospel doctrine class, I found myself with this tremendous desire to finally make sense of prophecy. And I read and I read and I read and reread things that I'd read years before. And I felt the need to know an answer about my own personal life and about this thing that was most important to me. I felt like I understood the gospel pretty well. Like I said, I taught gospel doctrine classes in every ward I'd been in since my mission at that point. My kids were still young. My oldest was just in kindergarten, but we had 5. So, or we had our 5th while we were there. And so I needed some answers, and I determined that probably the thing to do is one evening after the kids were in bed was to go up on that hill and have occasion, because there's I don't remember who mentioned it to me, said, well, if you really want to pray, you have to pray out loud. You have to be alone where there's no one around, and you have to speak openly and plainly with the Lord. So that's what I did. I tucked the kids in, told my wife I was going to go for a walk, and I'll be back in a half an hour or so. I climbed to the top of the hill, and I made it a matter of prayer. I can't remember what I said, but I did do a lot of begging and pleading to know what my purpose was here in life and what it was I was supposed to do. I fully expected to get an answer, but I didn't. It didn't really bother me, but I sure wish I had, at least at the time. But it was a gratifying experience. I stood, I didn't kneel, I stood and I prayed. I think it was a matter of days, maybe a week or 2 later. I opened the current issue of Reader's Digest. This was, I think, 1975, 1976, somewhere in there. And I would always read every issue, cover to cover, jokes, everything. Because in those days they had really interesting articles, a lot of meaty stuff. I've since discontinued that practice many years ago because they changed their editorial style. But at the time, they included a condensed version of a book in the back. Usually it was fiction. But this month, it was a condensed version of nonfiction by an author named Emanuel Velikovsky. And it was his book, Worlds in Collision. And I'd heard his name on several occasions. In fact, when I was a missionary, one of my companions, he and his twin brother were in the same mission. One of my companions came to me and said, well, I was reading Dwayne Crowther's book. And he said, well, you know, there's this guy wrote a book about how a comet caused the Exodus. And I said, that's nonsense. How could a comet cause the Exodus? You know, I dismissed it entirely. But when I read the actual book by Velikovsky, I was floored. I realized that of all of the theories, and if you're at all a fan of prophecy, as I have been, you will know that there are any number of explanations for the water turning to blood, or the pillar of fire and smoke, or the darkness, or the plagues, or whatever. Any number of explanations. None of them very satisfying. Here was an explanation that I could believe in, as strange as it seemed. He was the only person that looked outside our earth for the cause. And as tough as that was to understand, what made good sense was that it explained all of the phenomena of the Exodus. Everything connected to this one central cause, this body passing close. Well, I was enamored. I mentioned to my wife at the time, Susan, and I said, you know, this makes good sense. If he's right, I know Joseph Smith or someone will have said something that I've missed that will corroborate what Velikovsky said. Because I measure everything by the gospel, the restored gospel. That is my guide, that is my key. It always has been, always will be. It's been set that way for 72 years. I doubt it's going to change in the near future. So I endeavored to search first the scriptures, then corroborating material, the comprehensive history of the church by B.H. Roberts. I looked everywhere. Could not find anything that said, yeah, the Exodus was caused by a planet. And this corresponded with my initial impression. I don't remember seeing anything in everything that I've read. Somebody said, I'm telling people, other Latter-day Saints, this what I'm discovering. This is exciting. Look, this might be an answer. Somebody said to me, well, have you read the history of the church? I said, yeah, B.H. Robertson. No. There's Joseph Smith's journal. It's called The History of the Church. You mean all these years I've been studying the gospel, I didn't know that Joseph Smith had a journal? Well, come to think of it, when I took religion classes at BYU, somebody said something about that. Anyway, I went and I got the paperback version, 6 volumes. The 7th is an index, but it's 7 books. And I started reading volume 1, volume 2, volume 3. Nothing. I'm just about to throw up my hands in despair. I'm coming up empty. Maybe Velikovsky's just another one of those crazy concepts that I could classify with all the rest of them and just have to wonder who was right. But I got to volume 5, and I was nearly far past the middle, page 300 and something. And I was reading a sermon that Joseph Smith gave on the Nauvoo Temple grounds. Is that how it's spelled? Doesn't look right. Anyway, Nauvoo.
I think there's only one V, but
What's that?
I think there's only one V.
Is it well, the first
All
one's
that's
correct.
U.
Just
Oh, did
make
I
your-
put
First
two
one's
V's?
a, the first one's a U, and then it's V.
Oh.
Nauvoo. Sorry. Well, my penmanship leaves a lot to be desired. So, Nauvoo. Joseph and the congregation are standing in the footings for the Nauvoo temple, and he's lecturing, and it's like most of his lecture, filled with spiritual insight. Wonderful story, wonderful sermon. And then he swerves off on an entirely different topic. And of course, you don't know the circumstances. Maybe there was something in between and they didn't get it all down in the record. But he says, in the last days, there will be great signs shown forth. The oceans heaving beyond their bounds, and the sun darkened. I thought, oh, this has promise. This is my territory, Why? Because those are things that Velikovsky had talked about, The earth shaking, the stars falling. I've forgotten all of the references, but you can read it for yourself. History of the church. Be careful you don't be careful you don't get the B.H. Roberts comprehensive history, because when you do an online search, you get B.H. Roberts. You don't get the history of the church. You have to make sure you're looking at the right thing. And it's volume 5, page 350 something. Like I said, I can't quote chapter and verse. I never can. Anyway, Joseph talks about these things. And he says, the earth will be shaken and the seas will heave beyond their bounds and the sun will be darkened and the moon won't give its blood. Wow, that's it. And then he said, and then there will be one grand sign. And you know what signs are. I won't try to define it, we'll find out as we go along. And he says, what will the world do? They'll say it's a comet, planet. I won't belabor the issue right here, but Joseph often in his discussions of cosmological things, and we only have a few statements from him and from men who associated with him, men and women, that commented on his comments on these things, but he equated the two. In our perspective, a comet is one thing and a planet is something entirely different. But you could have knocked me over with a feather when I read that. And the reason for that is that Dr. Velikovsky, who I was trying to confirm with Joseph Smith's statement, said that the object that caused the Exodus was a planet-sized object that looked and behaved like a comet. The very words that Joseph Smith used almost 200 years ago. And it was like being hit over the head with a hammer. Suddenly, this was the focus. This was the commonality that I'd been looking for. This was the substantiation. Joseph goes on to say, and what will they do? They'll say it's a comet or a planet. But it is the last grand sign of the coming of the Son of Man. And then he goes back into his sermon again. It's like he put it in there so I could see it. I know that's egotistical, but that's how it felt. That's how it felt. And for, 5 minutes, it's like somebody had opened my cranium and was just pouring stuff in. Because all of a sudden I saw the connection. And here's the connection. Exodus, which was what Velikovsky wrote about. I've got this on the wrong side. Let me move it over here. Exodus, what Velikovsky had written about, caused by a comet planet, which we know today is Venus. Joseph Smith didn't say that. Velikovsky did. Exodus, well written. The event of the Exodus, this was the primary thought that entered my mind. This is one of the many. Exodus was an archetype for the events recorded in Revelation, John's book in the New Testament. Because the very same things are predicted for Revelation. Seas heaving beyond their bounds, darkness, hail and fire from the heavens, all the Exodus events, earthquakes, thunder and lightning, all of it. The very same manifestations listed by Moses in Exodus are listed by John in Revelation. And in the same way, in the writings and visions of Joseph Smith. So here's the first prophet of this dispensation connecting the signs of the last day with an astronomical body. The very thesis that Velikovsky, the part that I found the most incredible, suddenly became the most credible part. And all the signs of the Exodus, all the miracles of the Exodus are connected to this comet Venus. That's connected to the comet planet of Revelation, even though John doesn't mention it, Joseph Smith does, calling it the grand sign. It all goes back to this man, this incredible man, this amazing man. I know what he suffered in his life. Like, I've read about it. I haven't suffered it, you know. But I know the price he had to pay for talking about these things. And I've since discovered how quickly we as Latter-day Saints disregard the things that he thought were the most important. Because we get focused in the wrong places. That's another story. So this was what I discovered back in 1975. Long about 1980, after at least a dozen of my close friends said, you know, I'm tired of hearing about this, write a book. I did. A good friend of mine, Kay Jensen, one of the finest people, he's dead now, but one of the finest people I've ever met, a real saint, said, you know, I'm tired of hearing this, Tony. There's this newfangled typewriter called a computer. He had a cassette duplication company, and I was making master tapes for him for the books on tape and stuff that he did. He said, see that computer over there? He said, I want you to sit down and write a book. Write it all down. I thought, that's a capital idea. I'll try that. This computer used floppy disks that were 8 inches. They were huge. It was just one generation up from the whirling half-inch reel-to-reel or 1-inch tapes that they used, which was just one generation from the card stacks, the punch cards that they used to begin with. So, and I used a program called WordStar. I know all these details are just fascinating to you, but indulge me because it is my backstory. I sat down and I wrote a rough draft. I intended to bring it with me tonight, but I'm packing some stuff, like I said, to go to California to try to sell my ranch, and it's packed away somewhere. I'll find it maybe in the next life, I don't know. So, I submitted it to Deseret Book and I don't know, half a dozen other LDS publications. Can I take my jacket off? Is that kosher?
Yeah,
It's just a little too warm in here when I'm flapping my jaw. Thanks. And I got some very courteous but firm no, we're not interested. Deseret Books wrote back and said, it's a worthy subject, but we're not inclined to publish it. And I don't remember who it was I asked, one of the publishers. I said, well, I've sent to this one, Bookcraft, some that don't even exist anymore now. Is there anybody I haven't talked to? He said, well, there's this new guy coming up, Keith Terry, and he has Crown Summit Books, and you might want to approach him. So I quickly got an address and wrapped up the standard stuff, self-stamped addressed envelope so that so I could hear from them, and shipped it off. A couple of weeks went by, and one day the phone rang, and I was at home. It was, I think, in the evening. Hello, Anthony? Yeah, this is Anthony. My name is Keith Terry. I'm with Crown Summits Books. I wondered if you'd be willing to let me publish your book. Oh. sure. I mean, that's why I sent you the manuscript. But it's going to need a lot of work. He said, well, I was just going to publish it as it is. I said, oh, no. I know my failings pretty well, and one of them is spelling and proper punctuation. And I never expected to be an author. I didn't pay much attention in school. I'm sorry. I was an average student. So he said, well, I have a friend. Let's see if I can remember his name. Last name was Young. I have a friend, he says, it's an editor. He's a good editor. He said, if you'd be willing to split the costs with me, I'll take it out of your royalties. We can have him edit the book. I think it was Alan Young. Anyway. I got in touch with him. It was like I'm getting instruction here, so I'm going to stand back. It was like a crash course in writing. Alan said, oh, you got comets going here and planets going there, and you're just going to confuse your readers. He laid out a chapter outline for me, and he said, now I want you to take this, we'll do it a chapter at a time. You take this first chapter and you rewrite it. Look, doing this. And I would rewrite and take it back to him, and he'd mark it all up and show me what was wrong. And he didn't write it for me, he taught me how to write in about 3 or 4 months. Every few days I'd go back with more material. He'd correct it, I'd pick it up, go home, rewrite, till I had a finished manuscript. Yeah. Thank goodness for the people that came along at the right time. And Alan was one of them. I think his name was Alan Young, anyway. Submitted the final manuscript to Keith. He published, again, I wanted to have the originals here, but they're in storage. Published it with kind of a watercolor cover on the thing. And he changed the title from And the Moon Shall Turn to Blood, which was suggested to me by Kay Jensen's son, Mike. And that's where the titles came from. It wasn't my invention, but I liked it, obviously. And I was going to call it Mormonism and Catastrophism. That was the working name of, boring, huh? But accurate. Completely accurate, totally marketable. So what happens is he comes out with this watercolor cover, and he added the very last days to the title. And there was no prophecy trilogy in those days. It was just And the Moon Shall Turn to Blood, the very last days, which I agreed with. You know, it was more than just the last days as most of us look at it. It's the very final event of the last days, if you will. The book came out. Keith Terry put a great deal of money into the promotion of it, bought time on KSL radio in Utah, and maybe even a couple of other stations, and momentum started to gather, and the book started to go out of the bookstore. And I was thrilled. Eventually he approached me and said, I want you to do a non-denominational edition. Hal Lindsey wrote a book and created this video that they four-walled in theaters around the country called The Late Great Planet Earth. Maybe some of you remember that or seen it. Hal Lindsey's a Baptist preacher, and even for a period of time he may still has a radio show of his own where he talks about prophecy. Which reminds me, when I was also, I wanted to tell you this, when I was a kid, we just got a TV set a year or two before this, but I would go up Sunday nights and I had a little crystal set. Have you ever just had one earplug? And it was just a little tiny thing with an alligator clip on one end, and you'd ground it somewhere on an electrical outlet or anything that was grounded, and you could listen to the radio, and you tuned it by moving this rod in and out. It was just a little crystal set. And my parents would send me up to bed. I had a bedroom that my dad had remodeled up in the attic. And I would tune into a station that had Herbert W. Armstrong, another Baptist minister. And his program was called The World Tomorrow with Herbert W. Armstrong. Da, 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 you know. And he talked about Daniel and the beasts and how the various parts of Daniel represented the Union, the European Union, and how it had broken up after the Second World War, and how it was a perfect fulfillment of biblical prophecy, and the atomic bomb was a fulfillment of the destructions prophesied. You see, that was when I was 13, 14, maybe 15. How many kids do you know that do that sort of stuff? You know, that's how weird I am. I've written this before. Most people see me as a keeper of odd knowledge, you know, and because the knowledge is odd, so am I. Or maybe it's the other way around. I don't know. Anyway, I mentioned that because now that I'd published my book, Hal Lindsey was a very successful author, made a great deal of money, and Keith Terry, my publisher, said, get ready. He says, we're going to do this non-denominational book. I've got a bishop in California that's invested 20 grand in this. We're going to print. He says, can you do me a non-denominational edition of the book? Sure. I can take Joseph Smith out of it and still make the argument. So I did. And he published it and sent it to a Christian distributor in Texas. A year or so later, when Keith Terry went out of business, I called the distributor because I knew there were 8,000 copies of these books in his warehouse. And when I told him my name and the name of the book, that book. He said, I can't give that thing away. Sure, if you'll send me the money, I'll ship them to you. But he said, if not, we're just going to toss them in the dumpster because we can't sell. Nobody wants your books. And I told Keith, I said, you know, I'm not at all sure this idea is going to fly with anybody outside the church. Joseph Smith, it wouldn't fly with Mormons, and Joseph Smith talked about this stuff. But most Mormons think it's heresy when they open the book and you what? I must be honest here. At first, when people started buying those books en masse, I thought, yes, it's just a matter of time before I can reintroduce the very information to the church that Joseph taught 150 years ago. This is great. People were buying the books. Turns out, what did I do with my pen? You got all this, right?
The video does.
That's what I mean. Well, you folks sitting here got it, right?
Yep.
Okay. Turns out, those books on the shelf, well, the first book, the first edition, had an odd watercolor thing. I told you about that. But when Keith Terry went out of business because he invested all this money in my non-denominational edition, told me, don't spend the money yet, Anthony, but you're going to be a wealthy man. And I let myself believe it, which was kind of a mistake. Anyway, as soon as Keith Terry dropped it, I said, I'm going to get rid of that watercolor cover. And I know I've got enough material for a second. I never intended to do a book in the first place. But when the first book was successful, I thought, that's it. I'm not going to write any more books. What more am I going to say? But as I continued my research, and I did something that any scholar will tell you is a terrible mistake, and that's to publish before you're absolutely sure of your thesis. I was certain of my thesis, I just didn't know all the details. But I figured they'd kind of take care of themselves, naive, but that's what I thought. So when Keith Terry dropped it, I said, I'm going to publish it myself. I had a little bit of extra money. I borrowed some from my parents. Actually, they're the ones that had the extra money. I had very little extra money. Credit where credit is due. And I published the Moon book, Moon Shall Turn to Blood. And immediately I wrote a second book. This was volume 1. And the earth shall reel to and fro. Call it the Earth Book. Volume 2 of the Prophecy Trilogy. And I knew I had a third book in me. I just hadn't written it yet. Again, call it hubris, call it naivete, whatever you want to call it. I thought, well, I can manage a third book. There's enough to say. So I started writing. As soon as these were published with the new covers, sales immediately, you know, you see these bar charts, sales went. I thought, great, we're on a roll. I've found the formula. I wrote this third book, and just as I was about to go to the printer again with it, I had a call from a doctor, and I cannot tell you his name, lived in Orem. Can I have a few minutes of your time, Anthony? Sure. Gave me his address. He was an emergency doctor, so he's always on call. He said, so I'm not going to come to you. He says, can you come to me? I did. He said, there's this guy named Dave Talbot. Who has picked up on Velikovsky's thesis. And I said, I know who Dave Talbot is. He and his brother, Stephen, wrote the little shortened version of Velikovsky's scenario that I included in my very first book, in the appendices of my very first book. I know who Dave Talbot is. He's written a book called The Saturn Myth. Have you read it? No. No, I haven't. He said, well, you got to get it. Will you lend me your copy? Sure. Took his copy and Xeroxed it, brought it back to him. So that way I don't lose books, okay? I know how important books are. Read The Saturn Myth, and if any of you know, Dave Talbot referenced Velikovsky. He was a big supporter of Velikovsky. He published, he was going to Portland State, some university at the time. He published a magazine called Pensée, arguing the validity of Velikovsky's thesis. Still interesting reading if you ever have a chance. And he started up a series of quarterly publications called Chronos. All this I found out in time good to this good doctor. Discovered that Talbot had taken an unpublished manuscript by Velikovsky that said Saturn is the key to understanding the very early information in our solar system. You got to read this stuff. So Velikovsky still is influencing Talbot, who's influencing yours truly. And Talbot said, well, all of the myths and legends of mankind talk about the North. The celestial North, where everything happens. And I thought, you know, that's right. That's what it says in the scriptures. Everything is about the North. Even the Big Dipper on the west wall of the Salt Lake Temple points north. Wow. He said, well, Saturn used to dominate the heavens, and it had 3 rings around it. and it produced this cruciform figure with this great polar mountain beneath it. I took my third book that I'd written, trashed it, and rewrote it around the Saturn myth. And I showed Joseph Smith's illustration called the Dibble. Oh. How come, maybe I am dyslexic, I don't know. Philo Dibble, one of a notable early Latter-day Saint, Joseph Smith's bodyguard, knew the man intimately, said, look, Joseph drew this picture for me. And the picture, he said, is what the ancient earth used to look like. And sure enough, it's this configuration of planets like this, with this shared axis, the very thing that Talbot had written in his Saturn myth. Only Joseph Smith drew the picture off axis to show the planets in this line. He even draws a line through it like that with the plane of the ecliptic here. Philo Dibble said, Joseph drew this picture for, and this is why I say, Latter-day Saints were really quick to drop these concepts because they didn't see how it pertained to the gospel of Jesus Christ. They couldn't make the connection. So it's no wonder we can't make the connection today. At least they had the prophet to reference, But we stopped talking about it. So the prophets stopped talking about it, The brethren come from the body of the church. So what one generation doesn't talk about, the next generation knows nothing of. Pretty simple formula. And so the plain and precious things of the gospel go missing. And it only took a couple of generations. Philo Dibble taught this stuff, illustrated the planets. After the saints moved out here to Utah, he settled in Springville. 1902, somebody got a hold of his illustration. They executed a legal affidavit saying, yeah, this is the real thing. This is what Joseph Smith said, and da-da-da-da. Well, what they say Joseph Smith said tells me they really didn't understand what Joseph Smith was talking about. They got it mixed up. But if you just look at the illustration itself, forget what Dibble and the rest said, look at what Joseph drew, and I've got examples of this in my third book. That's why I'm talking about it here, based on the Saturn myth. Talbot said from an earthly view it looked like this. Joseph Smith said from an off-axis view it looked like that. Again, just like the books of Exodus and Revelation, here are two disparate sources saying the same thing. One of them is a prophet of God. Anyway, the rest they say is history, as they say. The last book I called A New Heaven and a New Earth. And each time I put out a book, the sales went up again. And heaven forgive me, but I thought that would go on indefinitely. In about in 1993 through 1995, those sales plummeted just as suddenly as they had started. And suddenly I couldn't give my books away. Turns out, I think, again, this is my story, so I'm going to tell it the very best way I know how. Turns out these covers that I commissioned for these books, side by side on the shelves at Deseret Book around the country, were intriguing. And people were picking up the book and ostensibly reading it. I thought, like I said earlier, It was just a matter of time before I was going to be able to influence enough Latter-day Saints that this would once again become part of LDS, don't want to say doctrine, but at very least LDS worldview. It's not really, well, it is doctrine, let's call it what it is, but it's just not something that the brethren are going to talk about because it just makes it more difficult for them to fulfill their mission. And I understand that perfectly. They're there to teach the gospel, to make sure it gets taken to the world. And this kind of stuff isn't good missionary material. This is for Latter-day Saints who already have testimonies and want to understand their gospel even better. Okay? Not missionary stuff. Anyway, these books side by side on the shelves made a lovely display. Anybody in the bookstore looking around for a book to buy would see these 3 books and they'd pick them up. So the books sold real well. What I've discovered since is about maybe 60% of them we're just tossing them, putting them on a shelf. I've had people contact me and say, well, my Aunt Phoebe or my Uncle John had it on their shelf and told me I needed to read it, and I never did until one day I pulled it off the shelf, and lo and behold, there's this great information in this book. I never knew it existed. So, but I really wasn't making much of an impact. I was selling books, but even the people that bought the books weren't reading them. I mean, they certainly weren't understanding them. So that brings us down to today, and I still struggle to teach, and these 3 books are, I still got a lot of them. The last time I printed 5,000 copies. That was in 1992, 91, just before the sales took a nosedive. And I still got a 5x5 storage shed full of the books because nobody wants to read them. They trickle out a Deseret book. I get it, maybe 2 or 3 orders a month, if that much. And that's it. So I decided, instead of publishing, oh, by the way, after finishing the 3 books, I still did a lot of research. I was still making connections. And I realized that I was learning some really important material that I couldn't include in the books without reprinting. And printing was out of the question without any sales. I had no financial means to publish more. So I decided to put it in online lessons. Which is where it is today. It's 16 one-hour lectures. 16. And that just covers the basics. And it shows how Joseph Smith taught all of this material to the early saints, and how with that understanding we can study the work of mythologists like Dave Talbot and a whole host of others that are researching in this new area to understand what Nibley calls cosmism. And of course, Nibley talks about it at length. How much time do we have, Steve?
Well, don't forget about your Revelation classes.
What's that?
Your Revelation
Oh,
classes.
I followed the online lessons up, the 16 1-hour with 11 hours, 11 1-hour classes on Revelation, where I go through, I show how understanding the basic cosmological archetypes. I have that much left?
It's 8:10.
It's 8:10, so I'm done. Well, let me just finish up. how the cosmological connection allows you to understand what Joseph Smith was talking about, how it connects historically, and how knowing the cosmological imagery, you can now go to the book of Revelation, John's book of Revelation, the one that confused me the most when I was a primary kid. The Apocalypse. And you can read it verse by verse, the way it was intended to be read, the way it was intended to be understood by the man who wrote it. You don't have to find this little piece here and that little piece and the rest you don't understand. Verse by verse. I go through 2 chapters each in 11 one-hour classes, 22 chapters of the book of Revelation, and explain how the imagery that John used is the same imagery that Joseph Smith talked about in the documentary History of the Church and in many other places I've discovered since, that is the same thing that these mythologists like Talbot are talking about and that Nibley talks about in all of his courses and calls cosmism. Of course, we all know what a scholar Nibley was. He got right up to the point where you could talk about these images, all this imagery that the prophets used, and he never connects it directly as I do. But reading him is a treasure trove of information once you understand the archetypes that come from mythology. And it all fits together hand in glove. The gospel of Jesus Christ, the history of the world. This is why I believe Nephi wrote, God said to him, I've spoken to all people, and they've written down what I've read. And that information will come forth in the last days. And you look around you, and Nibley said, well, there's just tons of material. We've uncovered 24 creation myths from different cultures. Well, that's what the Lord's talking about. He's not talking about scripture like the Bible or the Book of Mormon. He's talking about the language that they understood. And the language, common denominator. You know, when you do a fraction, you know, when you're adding fractions, you've got 4/5 here and 2/3 there. So you have to figure out a common denominator. What does 5 and 3 go into? Well, it's 15. So you multiply these, you add them together, and then you reduce the fraction down to the least fraction. They're called common denominators. Okay? That's the key to solving the formula. You find the common denominators in all these myths. That's what Nephi was writing about in the Book of Mormon. He wasn't expecting to have the 10 tribes come forth with their scriptures like this. He's talking about them bringing their records. And what are their records? The records are the same ones that the Egyptians wrote down. Remember? Abraham says, well, Pharaoh was really trying to copy the true order. He just had it a little fouled up. But so were the Romans. So were the Greeks. So were the Persians. Thank you. So were the Polynesians. So were the Chinese. So were the Maya. And every little clan and culture around the world all have these same stories, the same ones that John's writing about in Revelation. They just remember it a little differently. But when you learn these archetypes, the cosmic archetypes that Nibley talks about, which were created by the appearance of these planets and plasmas in the heavens, suddenly you have the keys to deciphering all these ancient texts as well as the writings of the prophets. And with those keys, the book of Abraham comes alive. It's not a neglected book. Well, it is in the church. We quote maybe a half a dozen verses from the entire book of Abraham or Moses. You sit through a year of gospel doctrine classes. I don't care, even when it is about the pearl of great price, they hardly quote from the pearl of great price because we don't understand it. The people writing the manuals don't understand. Somebody in the church office building knows about this because, as Stephen pointed out, they've got the symbol of heaven man, the one that Joseph Smith calls the Son of Man. It's on the roof of the conference center. And it has no reason, nobody sees it unless you're using Google Maps or you're flying over in a helicopter. Why make the effort of putting it there? Same reason that the Lord used parables. For those who know what it means, it's great. For those who don't, curious, but no meaning. That is the way the gospel has always been taught. They do not tell you unless you ask. It's like being in a court of law. If you ask the right questions of the judge, you'll get the answer. But if you don't ask the questions, he won't volunteer it. He's an impartial judge. And so is our Father in heaven. If we want to know, we're going to have to work to find it. It's already been revealed. The answer's been right before us for 6, 7 generations now, thanks to Joseph Smith. Anyway, I'm way over time, but let me just summarize by saying, I wrote a monograph called The Last Lecture. It's a program they started at BYU years ago. And they asked people to get up and say what they would say if it was their last will and testament. What would they want to say to people? This is my last will and testament to you. This is my story. In hopes that you will see something of value in that and look at the information. Don't judge it by me. Judge it only by the information. Don't make the mistake of avoiding the information because you don't really like the messenger. I am of no consequence. It is the information that's important. And I urge all of you to seek it. And that's my message to you. Thanks.